Okay, I'm just going to introduce everybody really fast, and then I'm going to disappear. I'm Lisa from N+1. Really excited to have with us tonight Maggie Doherty, whose book, The Equivalents, A Story of Art, Female Friendship, and Liberation in the 1960s just came out last week, I think. Really exciting. Congratulations, Maggie. We've also got Miranda Popkey, who's not holding up her book, but her novel, Topics of Conversation, is also new. Really exciting. We've got Ari Brostoff, who's the culture editor at Jewish Currents. You can find their work in the forthcoming spring issue of N+1, among other places. We've also got Dayna Tortorici, who's N+1's co-editor. Thank you guys all so much for being here. To everyone who's tuning in, I encourage you to subscribe to N+1 at n+1mag.com/subscribe. It's the best way to support the magazine and our authors. And I'm going to turn it over now and disappear. Thank you guys so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's nice to, oh, Mark Krotov's in the chat, or maybe he's not. Maybe that's Lisa. Here on the publication of her book, The Equivalents. I too have a handsome copy here. And so, Maggie, to start this off, I wanted to ask you just to tell us a little bit about your book for people in attendance who don't know about it already, and sort of the questions that arose for you while you were writing it and what made you want to frame this event as a conversation about writing feminist history in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I have to just start by saying I'm so happy to be here at N+1, and it feels so fitting. I mean, huge thank you to Mark and Lisa and Dayna for setting this up. I really can't think of another magazine where you can write long form, highly almost theoretical or historical pieces on feminism. This is a magazine that runs pieces on the Scum Manifesto, on Maggie Nelson. It's very fun for me to be here because I think one of the first pieces I ever wrote, and maybe the first time Dayna and I corresponded over email, was about the writer Lydia Davis and the ways feminism crops up in her work. So this all feels like a real, just completely fitting and accurate place to be talking about this stuff. I guess I should hold up my copy of my book. So my book is the story of 5 writers and artists who formed a friend group and a kind of collaborative cohort in the early 1960s at a place called the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study. This was a pretty new venture out of Radcliffe College that was designed to, in the words of the women who founded it, get women kind of back on track in their careers, whether those careers were academic, kind of scholarly careers, or creative or artistic careers, to apply to this institute, which offered you office space, a part-time wage, a stipend that would be worth about $25,000 today, and access to university resources. You had to have either a PhD or the equivalent in artistic accomplishment. So that's why this group of artists called themselves the Equivalents. They included the writer Anne Sexton and the poet Maxine Cumin. These were 2 poets who were best friends and close collaborators. The writer Tilly Olson, the sculptor Mariana Pineda, and the painter Barbara Swan. Because the book is very much about their relationships and the conversations and collaborations and conflicts among them, I wanted to have a conversation with a bunch of writers I admire and who I think are so brilliant and talented and thoughtful about gender and feminism and politics. So I feel like I've really gotten away with something by gathering everyone together here and making them talk to me about things that I find interesting. And one of those things that I found as I was working on this book is thinking a lot about why do we go back to this history? What are we looking for? And when we are thinking about our own lives as political actors, as writers, what draws us back to feminist history in particular, or the history of sort of political struggle around issues of gender, and how should we relate to this material? How should we relate to those who have come before us? Should we be entirely celebratory and grateful? Should we be critical? Should we be using their work to inform ours, or should we be kind of pushing back on it? This was incredibly challenging for me while working on this book that takes place in the 1960s, which is in many ways a very different time than ours, although in some other ways quite similar, unfortunately. And so I wanted to gather together a few people who write and think about these ideas to just hear from them, you know, how do they present and engage with other thinkers and writers on topics of gender and feminism. So I'm so excited to talk to Miranda and Ari and Dayna about this.
Is it fair if we ask you to go first and talk about that with your own book?
I think it's entirely fair because I forced you to be here. So I really should be the one to sort of kick things off. So I think one thing that struck me as challenging when I wrote about an institution that was founded to help women and to help women who were seen as women of talent, that was the word that was used in its promotional materials, or sometimes the founder, Polly Bunting, who was president of Radcliffe, referred to them as highly educated and highly accomplished women. That this is the intervention that the Institute made. One of the things that is perhaps unsurprisingly revealed in the way that it tried to help and support women is that it was not incredibly conscious of class. It was not incredibly conscious of race. Tilly Olson, who was a working class woman and a leftist and a communist and an activist, was very attuned to the kind of neglect and absences in the Institute. But I found, very early in the stages of researching this book, and then to be, frank, in the stages of selling it and pitching it, that you can't actually pitch a project if you want to say this is entirely wrong. If you're going to say, this had a ton of flaws and it didn't work and it ignored women and it was so targeted, the response from an editor or publisher is, well, then why do we want to read? Ask myself that question. Why do we want to read about it? And I think for me, one thing that feels important and valuable in turning backward and looking back at feminist thinkers and writers and artists, or even women who didn't associate themselves with feminism, is looking at the kind of heterogeneity and diversity in these different moments in feminist history, that I think sometimes there's a tendency to think of the development of feminist politics is fairly linear, that we move from one phase where we're concerned with one kind of issue to another phase where we're concerned with a different kind of issue with entirely different demographics. And then almost teleologically, we end up at intersectional class-conscious feminism that's sort of doing all of these things. And what has felt important to me in looking backward is seeing that all of those strands of thought are present at all of these different historical moments. And even within the group of women in this book, there were conflicts and tensions between women who had to work a day job and women who sat at home and didn't have, and had, hired out childcare and domestic help. That was a tension in the group. There was a tension among the group in terms of how political their work should be. And so I think that was really important and gratifying to me, in part because it allowed me just to write the conflict. I didn't have to come in as the representative of, 2016 when I started writing this book, of 2016 or 2018 or 2020, and say, these women didn't understand how important class was, because thankfully I had someone in the book who did, or there was entirely race blindness at the Institute because eventually students at Radcliffe pushed back on the admission policies and demanded more racial representation. So I guess that was my best way of negotiating some of these tensions between our own moment and our own political awareness and what we see in the past, is finding those voices in the past itself who were talking about these things and were pushing forward some of the things that we associate more with our contemporary moment. That was my best way around it. In some ways it worked, in some ways I don't know that it did, but I would love to hear from the rest of you, what do you go back for? What do you look backwards to find, and how do you update it, or do you update it, or how do you bring it into our current moment?
It's a great question. Miranda, Ari, do you want to start?
I can jump in if yeah, I mean, I would say I think I started thinking about these questions in kind of a similar way to what you were just saying, Maggie, when I was in grad school, because, you know, at the point that I was a teenager and discovering feminism or an undergrad, there was such a narrative around kind of the idea that we had moved on from the second wave, right, which was tended to be framed as this kind of monolith. And, you know, I think that was for different reasons. Like sometimes it was unfair, and other times I think it was just the result of being of a younger generation reading things by writers who were around in an earlier moment where they were actually kind of bracketing a whole lot because they're really writing to each other. And so what they meant was maybe something more specific in ways than, you know, than I was like able to appreciate at that time. But by the time I was in grad school, it was clear that actually, you know, things were much more complicated. And I think that was becoming clear to a lot of people around our age at that time. And I think that one thing that really crystallized it for me was reading these anthologies, like, you know, Robin Morgan's book, Sisterhood is Powerful, or Toni Cade Bambara's The Black Woman, where, I mean, there's like brilliant stuff in these books, and there's just completely bonkers stuff very early in the, you know, so-called second wave moment, like right around, you know, 69, 70 kind of moment. And they, you know, they're incredibly heterogeneous. And, you know, you see it also in, important one for me was Alice Eccles' book, Daring to Be Bad, which is just like this incredibly detailed, like fascinating history, like movement history of like radical feminism starting in the late 60s. And, you know, there were just so many factions and everybody was doing something different. And like, some of them were like, I mean, they were on, again, like on the one hand doing like this incredibly powerful work. And then on the other hand, you'd have like a group of like 5 people in Boston whose thing was like, we are lesbian separatists, but also we only practice celibacy. Like, you know, and like they would be fighting with literally everybody else. And I think that is actually hard to appreciate now. Like not just like hard to appreciate value or something, but it's like hard to actually even like countenance how much it was like that, because it's really, I mean, like the internet has actually made a degree of kind of collective, like getting on the same page just possible in a way that, you know, is, I think, fairly new. And I think like, yeah, it's very, it's I think a really interesting challenge to like go back and just try to figure out what to make of that level of divergence within a movement.
Yeah, I am so glad that you brought up anthologies, in part because I have this like silly little prop with me. I was in New York in probably 2018 or 2019. I was staying in a friend's apartment, and I just walked by a table where there were some free books, including this reader. It's called Reading Women's Lives, and it's just clearly for some undergrad, like feminist thought 101. Like,
is it by?
It's compiled by the faculty of the Department of Women's Studies at The Ohio State University. And it just has a whole range of, I'll just read the first few contributors. Katha Pollitt, Curtis Sittenfeld,
Jenny Yamato, Audre Lorde, Birch Moon Woolman Baird, like just a lot of different people contributing little essays. And it's clearly meant as like an introduction for a 19-year-old who is taking this class because they've never heard of feminism before and they have to fulfill a humanities requirement. But I found this so interesting to read because I did not take any gender women's studies classes in college. I'm very much the dilettante of this group as the fiction writer who has never studied feminist theory in any formal way. And I think the degree to which terms and ideas and ways of moving forward are up for debate, and you can see how still up for debate they are in this book and in the anthologies that Ari was talking about. I think that can be exciting, as well as it is sort of depressing to read these essays and be like, oh man, we are still having these arguments on the internet today. But it's also, I think there's also a hopefulness to it that these are the essential questions that we are always going to be sort of struggling with. And to go back and see how people have dealt with these kinds of disagreements before, I found it quite exciting as someone who does not have any formal training in this kind of work, to see how many different ways of going about it there were, confronting the problem that is like, heterosexist white patriarchy. There are just a lot of ways to try and figure out how to combat that. And I think that is very, it can be very exciting to discover that even as like an older person, as I was.
I didn't study feminist history in college either. And I think that returning to the question of what do you go back looking for, I think a lot of it is like recognition and identification, whether it's with the conflicts or with the people and the characters and the situations that feel sort of intractable. For me, when I was discovering certain moments in second wave feminism, American feminism, a lot of the inspiration to go back was really just a feeling of rage that this history had been denied me. I really felt like it had been metabolized by popular culture as Ari said, as something that had been processed and happened and, moved beyond in some sort of synthesis. And at the same time, there was already a kind of the second wave is canceled vibe from women's and gender studies departments. Like they didn't teach that stuff really, unless you were taking a much more focused class. Like if you were taking Black feminism, or if you were taking, theories of sexual subjectivity and studying like Lacanian film critics, like super, super, super specific stuff. And so to go back and read like the New York radical feminists and that whole wave of the women who are described in the Alice Eccles book, I was just like, oh, they're speaking about it super candidly. It's all right here. Like the nerve endings are all over this prose. Like they're on fire. These people are like in the thick of it. And reading the primary documents of that moment was really inspiring. And I think just putting in another word for the anthologies, I was just rereading Women in Sexist Society, the one that was co-edited by Vivian Gornick. And yeah, again, like an amazing range of contributions. But I think the question of how to write that history is really different. Like how to read it and how to write it are different responsibilities. And I think as for how to write it, I would want to ask you guys if you feel a particular obligation, especially you, Maggie, writing about feminism, to basically correct for the whitewashing of previous feminist scholars narrating this moment historically, maybe unintentionally. But do you feel like you have to overcompensate, or just it's your responsibility to compensate for that sort of blanket assumption about what second wave feminism is monolithically.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that the scholars I've read on this often are very attentive to everything we've talked about, right? And I think, Dayna, the way you put it about this history sort of being denied to you, I think it might have been the writer and critic Michelle Dean, who I saw say right around the time her book Sharp came out, there's just an incredible amnesia around feminism and feminist history. There's a kind of amazing forgetting that happens every time. And this happens despite the fact that we have writers and critics and scholars and activists who are bringing this up all the time. If you actually go in and you look and you go to an organizing meeting, or you read an anthology, or you read, a zine or any of these materials at any point in the recent past, you're going to see all this stuff come up, but there seems to be this kind of force that just keeps wiping it out every time. So I don't think I was necessarily in attending to or in trying to sort of bring up some of this diversity or conflict within the second wave, doing anything new or doing anything that hadn't been done before. What I struggled with more, I would say, is what the works like The Feminine Mystique, which was published in the time period that my book covers. It was published in '63. It was a really interesting book for the women at the Institute, in part because the Institute's founder had collaborated with Friedan on that book for a period of time. So there was a lot of ways that this project was kind of in dialogue with her book. But that book, I think, was so hugely important for so many women, for so many readers. When it was published, it was hugely galvanizing. And I think to our eyes, also hugely flawed. When we read it now, I've taught this book to undergraduates and they're enraged by it and they think it's worthless. And they say, why do we even bother looking at this? It's so narrow, it's so myopic, it's not addressing these issues that we really, that we know are important, that we want to address. And so for me, the struggle was, how do I present the kind of groundbreaking and galvanizing force that was this book and be kind of, this is a silly word for it maybe, almost empathetic as a writer, and sort of acknowledge the force and the emotion of this work, of this book, of these particular thinkers in a way that's not naive or irresponsible, or not being sensitive to the book's failures. So I think, as a pseudo historian, as someone who does not have a PhD in history, but as someone who writes history, I guess I tried to sort of remind myself that often who we are and what we believe is just very much conditioned by our historical moment and conditioned by the position we're born into, and to sort of inhabit and sympathize or empathize with the women I'm writing about who are in this historical moment, who are in these positions that they're in, and for whom these experiences were really real and really important to them. So that's the way I've grappled with it. Your question, Dayna, also reminded me of something we were talking a little bit about before, which is, there's a lot of writing and criticism on feminism today in the culture, a lot of, magazine pieces and blog posts, and should there be, one doesn't want to say a requirement, but, should this history be part of those pieces? There's a lot of dialogue and discourse around feminism. And do we sometimes think, oh, this would benefit from, reading Sisterhood is powerful, or does this discourse kind of have a life of its own and is going to exist in kind of parallel? So I would love to hear about either of these things. Like, what do we think of sort of the discourse? always a great question. And also, the writing, as writers, how do we present this kind of material?
I'll jump in here. I am not going to weigh in on the discourse, like good or bad, thumbs up or thumbs down. I do think one of the things that, to me at least, feels really important about this moment in feminist history is the way that women were encouraged to look at their own experiences, their own personal lives as, to reduce it to the slogan we all know, the personal is political. They were they were encouraged to look at their own sort of personal testimony and bring that into the political and the communal field so that a political analysis could be applied to it. And I think that that is why it's still, it can still be exciting to read a young person or a younger person discovering that their individual experiences can be part of a political discourse. And so you read a blog post by someone who is sort of just processing these things for the first time. And I think that that's a valuable contribution because it is, to use a Polly Bunting metaphor, an on-ramp. But then I do think it is appropriate for other people to jump in and say, hey, it looks like you're getting on, you know, the feminist freeway. Like, why don't you, you know, there's a really great sort of flyover or flyby, whatever they call those things. I'm from California, I should know this. There's a really great like little off-ramp you can take and like a little pit stop you can make, and you know, it'll gas you up for the next 100 miles. This is not a great metaphor. What I'm saying is that I think it should live side by side, and that, you know, the best feminist traditions are traditions of conversation, sometimes argument, and that jumping in and saying, yes, your personal experience is it's great, like bring that into the public sphere, but also people have done it before. See what they have done as well, which I think is sort of a parallel to what you were talking about, Maggie, in terms of writing history versus analyzing from the present moment what that history then means for us.
So I would say like, I think that part of what is required to figure out how to move through the amnesia is actually to understand what the amnesia is about. And I think one thing that it's about is that it actually is really hard. And I think, you know, this is true, I think, in some kind of like special ways within feminist traditions, and in other ways, it's kind of a larger issue that comes up in all kinds of struggles on the left or struggles for justice. But it's really hard to acknowledge how long these struggles take, and that you are constantly like, you know, going forward and backward at the same time, and that and that you lose all the time. And I think that part of what the amnesia actually does for people like psychically is it creates this kind of fantasy that, you know, if the feminist movement had only been adequately intersectional in 1968, then we would have won. And it's not true. Like, it's not how it works. And it's like this weird kind of like Platonic concept of, you know, what like a kind of like end of the horizon would or should be for any movement, where you can kind of like imagine where it's kind of imagined that that in the present we at least know what it should be, but in the past they didn't. And I think that, you know, it's like it's very hard to get out of that way of thinking, because it really like it requires sort of a simultaneous like huge amount of humility and also a huge amount of like fortitude, and that's very hard to like do both of those things at once. But I think that is like actually what it kind of takes, and like takes to like be, you know, sort of like on either side of it, to like either kind of be like responsible to a history of struggle, or to be like a like historian and recorder of that history. And, you know, and I think like for me, like the moments where it has felt most possible to like make that kind of leap, like the like empathetic leap or whatever you want to call it, is like, I don't know, like moments that I had, like I would say a lot of these again, like were sort of happening like in the same period where I was, you know, reading these anthologies and like reading all this material. But these moments of just feeling like very organically, you know, oh my God, like, you know, feminism saved my life kind of thing. And like, and it's so cheesy. Like I almost like it, like it's weird because it feels like a dead end. It feels like a thing that you like don't want to let yourself think because it feels like a dead end, but I actually think that it can be like an opening into history instead of like a closing off of it.
Totally, you segued perfectly into the addition I wanted to make, which is that I think one of the things that's so interesting about feminism, and particularly feminism in this period, but you could also say it of women's organizing or any kind of feminist movement that comes out in response, like from another struggle, whether it's abolition or the New Left or whatever it is in American politics or anywhere, bourgeois revolutions in Europe, etc., is that it has this huge, like, it's a psychological revolution in the mind of the female subject, where oftentimes in participating in a different, I mean, this is sort of a cliche of like how feminist struggles come to be, and obviously they don't all originate in this formula, but the idea that one sort of catalyst to feminist consciousness that a lot of female organizers experience is that while they are part of a different left struggle or they're conscious of another justice movement, they start to identify the ways that they too are a sort of class or caste of people that is subjugated in a systemic way, even among their comrades. And then they kind of start to think like, well, wait a minute, we need to start doing this for ourselves. But I think one of the sort of feminism saved my life things that sort of contributes to sort of new discourse is that, especially in the second wave, or I mean, whatever, I hate using this term, but especially, you know, in the late 60s, early 70s, radical feminist movements, gay liberation, a lot of the sort of gas in the tank that got people going was this revelation that no one was a better authority on their experience than them. And this was a group of people who was continuously told that they weren't allowed to take leadership positions, they weren't educated enough, they were not meant to be movement leaders or deserving of praise or money or jobs or whatever. And to suddenly, and, you know, probably beat over the head by different kinds of political analysis from all of their comrades, to suddenly have the authority to say, like, actually, nobody knows more about this than me. So for once in my life, like, everybody else has to shut the fuck up and I'm going to tell you what it actually is a huge moment in a person's kind of gaining nerve to have courage for life or for struggle, like what you're saying, Ari. And so I think that there is a kind of incredible bravado that comes out of this initial feminist consciousness moment, which is like, I get to speak. And then of course you look back on it and you're like, maybe talk too much. But it's hard to say to a person who is really feeling the pleasure of their own sort of centrality to history that actually, you know, you should probably read a little bit more because, like, you're not the subject of history. You know what I mean? And so I think that there's always going to be, like you were saying, there's always going to be sort of concurrent, I mean, you all said this, but the sort of concurrent development of young people being born onto earth all the time, discovering all this stuff personally in their adult psychological development, and then the slow history that is, you know, often institutionally neglected or repressed or whatever. And so, yeah, there has to be room for both, but it doesn't mean it's not totally maddening at times. Anyway, I should sort of kick back to some of our questions. So Maggie, I wanted to ask you a question about your literary and journalistic work in your political life. and how you see feminism as a subject of writing, and whether you think writing about feminism, is your politics or is your political contribution? How do you think about that? Is it something that happens alongside it?
Yeah, that is a big and important question. I mean, I think that one of the weird things about writing this book for me is that it felt, I feel personally that my personal politics were further left than the subject matter. And that was an interesting experience. I mean, if there's a character or figure I'm most aligned with in this book, it's Tilly Olsen, that her way of thinking about these issues does feel very close to mine. And I think when I wrote it, I think in the same reason probably anyone writes anything, which was that I was confused about a bunch of things in my own life, such as, what is family? Like, how does family relate to creative ambition? Motherhood, very scary to me. I would like to know more about how women with similar creative lives that or similar to the kind that I aspire to have navigated this. These are political issues, but I think at the time I was writing this book, I wasn't really thinking about them as politics. I was thinking of them, not to create a false binary, but as deeply personal. Just like I wanted sort of knowledge and answers for my own life. And I was doing this at the same time that I was organizing academics. That I've been part of academic organizing of grad students and contingent faculty since 2012, something like that. And so I think there is certainly a lot of complementarity between the work of organizing and the work of writing. But the hard thing to recreate in the writing life is the solidarity, is the sort of community and the mutual investment and the mutual aid. And I think the reason this book took the shape it did is it's because it's a story of solidarity, and it's a story of community, and it's a story of mutual aid. And so even though in my own experience of this, they felt very distinct. They felt like, well, the thing I do that's a little bit selfish is I write a book about things that are interesting to me. And then the thing I do that is, generous and generative is I do the work of organizing. And now that I'm sort of looking back on this and thinking about this now, I guess there probably was much more kind of cross-pollination and ways that the writing was taking on and taking after the organizing, and ways that I was bringing some of the things I was thinking about in writing to the organizing, making sure that the union we were trying to build was a union that was sensitive to issues of identity, right? And sort of, what do women, people of color, first year or first generation academics need a union to do for them when they enter academia? What are the unequal, and what can a union do to help them, which are of course the same questions I was sort of thinking through in the book. So I guess the big question for me is this question of the social or something. Like, how do you recreate the social? If you're someone concerned with the collective good, if you think of yourself as someone who has collective politics, how do you recreate that creatively? Sorry, that's a lot of creation happening in that phrase, but how do you make a creative life that has that sort of collectivity in it? And that's something that the Institute did for the women in this book, but I'd be very curious to hear if any of you have thought about that collectivity as writers. Like, where do you find solidarity, or where do you feel like you're part of a kind of collective or communal effort in some way?
Well, I can say the thing that I was telling you before we started was the surprise, which is that I had been aware of, I know that we don't really know each other, but I been aware that you were working on this book for a long time, because it was simple, and I was like, and I was so struck when I started reading it by the fact that it actually, I didn't realize how much it was going to be about specifically the relationship between Sexton and Cumin, and I actually the thing that my show and tell object is this book, which is a book that my advisor Nancy Miller wrote, called My Brilliant Friends, about feminist critics of her generation, sort of like a kind of group biography in a sense, different from what you're doing, because in her case she's writing about her contemporaries, but you know, I think there's definitely some common threads, but there was such a specific one that jumped out at me right away. I'll read you the passage. This is from Nancy's book, and you'll see. So this is about this is from Diane Middlebrook's biography of Maxine Cumin, talking about the relationship between Cumin and Sexton. So she writes, after Sexton built herself a new study, they both had special phones installed at their desks and used them through the day to check out drafts of poems. We sometimes connected with a phone call and kept the line linked for hours at a stretch, Cumin remembered. We whistled into the receiver for each other when we were ready to resume. And I mean, ever since I learned that story, I have loved it so much, and, you know, think about it very regularly and think about it in my own work life, which, you know, has certain aspects that, you know, can remind me of that. And I try to like tap into that, you know, and because it really does feel kind of utopian to me. And I think it was very cool to see the kind of like literalization of, you know, the meeting of like content and form or something, of like that story about collaboration being so kind of like central in some way. It seems like, even though, you know, I'm still at the beginning of your book, it seems like it's like really part of that framing, and it was uncanny and just like very exciting, and yeah, I so that's not really an answer to the question, I guess, but maybe I'll just let it stand as.
No, it's great. I have a copy of that in my office to me at the moment. Now I really want to go read it. But yeah, I mean, it actually reminds me, Ari, of Dayna's Ferrante piece in a way, right? About how do you form, I guess, you know, the word that's used a few times in that piece is sort of like sisterly, or I mean, there's like a mother-daughter, if I'm remembering it right. There's it's like almost an ideal mother-daughter relationship where separateness is allowed or something. Like the mothers are allowing the daughters to like forge their separate path while also kind of mentoring them. And I think what's so incredible and yeah, almost utopian about the collaboration between Sexton and Cumin is that they allowed each other to be different and separate. And when they talk about editing each other's poems, they're so insistent on that. They always say, oh, we never tried to sound the same. We never tried to give a poem, you know, a different voice or a different feel, because we knew we were such distinct poets. And I think for different reasons, and I think this does kind of take us back to the issue of feminist history and feminist politics as well, that there's sometimes is a fear about the sort of figurative daughter going her own way or doing something different, and that this is seen as a kind of rejection or referendum on the mother, literal or figurative choices. And so what does seem so ideal about collaboration or friendship as a different mode of relating is it allows for individuality, it allows for separateness, it allows for disagreement and conflict. So yeah, I actually think that kind of brings that story does really bring together a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about.
Miranda, what about you?
Well, I was going to say that the sort of my most relevant experience of the sort of collaborative communal experience as it relates to my writing life is the 2 years I spent in my MFA program. And I was sort of struck by what you were saying, Maggie, the selfish project of the book, of writing something that you're interested in versus the generous work that you do as an organizer. I also started organizing grad students when I was in graduate school. And one of the things that I have found unexpectedly maybe, but really like truly a benefit of having been in this program with other writers whose work I got to know very well and whose work I love, is that now that I'm no longer in the program, I still correspond with them and we still share work. Well, I have a really hard time writing, so I'm not sharing much work, but they will share work with me and I will get to provide whatever small bits of feedback I can provide. And that is a way to me of being selfish in that I'm doing something I like, which is reading creative work by a friend. But I'm also being generous because I'm offering some feedback. And I think what is really ideal about the kind of collaborative communion that your book explores and that the Institute imagined is that it does unite the selfish and the generous impulses by allowing people to come together to serve their own interests, but then also to help serve others' interests. And I don't think it's coincidental that I started organizing, doing union work when I was in a grad program that was showing me different ways in which I could be part of other people's writing lives. It was also, ultimately showing me different ways that I could be part of people's political lives as well.
I think it's interesting that I wonder what you make of it, Maggie, that a lot of the sort of collaborative models that we're talking about are either are editorial. Maybe that's just what it means to be a writer who is doing any kind of collaborative work. You're probably either co-authoring something or editing somebody else's thing. But also that there is a kind of, that labor is such a big deal, that labor organizing is such a big deal. When I was thinking about your question about ways that you form community with other creative people and writers, I was thinking not only of relationships with individual people who I trust to, coach me through a difficult piece or read something or vice versa, but also our actual labor organizers, people working for the National Writers Union or the Freelance Solidarity Project, trying to organize digital media, grad student unions, all of the Ari's tenant union. It seems like one is even tempted to say that is perhaps, I don't know if I agree with this, I'm just going to say it and make you talk about it. Is it best done in another institutional framework or within another slightly more organized struggle? Is the nature of, maybe with the exception of reproductive rights, are those battles now being waged sort of in the workplace for workers, framed as workers' rights issues? What do you think about that? Or housing rights issues, thinking of Moms for Housing, or community anti-gentrification efforts, like these are all things that might not be recognized as feminism, but are obviously being done by feminists, or the organizers are really putting forward a strong feminist argument for why they need to exist, whether it's sexual harassment, domestic abuse, anything that would be more typically recognized as like a woman's issue.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I want to go back to the editorial one because I am not an editor. So this will be an occasion to hear from those of you who do edit about what that kind of collaborative relationship is like. I recently read two books kind of together. One is a new history of feminism in the 90s called They Didn't See Us Coming, I think coming out in June. And it basically makes the argument that I think Dayna has just made, which is that the 90s seems like a kind of moment of feminist failure, because you have what Susan Flutie called the backlash. You have in media and sort of culture and entertainment, and sort of political rhetoric. You have the rollback of reproductive rights. You have welfare reform. But her argument in that book is that actually there was a lot of feminist organizing around issues that we don't think of as feminist, that this is a moment when the movement was taken over by women from the global south, by queer women, by women who were really concerned with environmentalism and the sort of disparate effects of environmental disaster, and that they were doing grassroots organizing, they were founding nonprofits, they were ascending to different positions in different organizations, but it didn't seem like they were doing feminist work because they were sort of not calling it that, or they were engaged in work that was visible in some different way or labeled in some different way. But one of the interesting things that book tracks is also what I think we could call the professionalization of feminism, that it becomes something that you can make a living by doing. You can work at a nonprofit, you can work for the Ms. Foundation, you can work for NARAL, you can be a professional activist. And to me, because I was also reading Jane McAlevy's book that I think you reviewed, Dayna, the book about the importance of deep organizing and sort of why the union as a institutional form is so powerful. Is it because it, when organized well, in her argument, it relies on sort of organic connections and leadership that develops in the workplace, because the workplace is where we spend a bunch of time, sort of not as much right now, but, for better and for worse, we have these, this is a site of struggle, the relationship between worker and boss, and it's a site where workers have the opportunity to forge connections. And so reading these books together both kind of stage this debate a little bit for me in a way that I don't yet have an answer to. Is sort of the labor movement and the union the best site for tackling any issue of oppression because it's such a strong form that does organizing in such a powerful way? Or are the issues that we would put under disparate and varied, and women are involved in so many different kinds of work, politically, activist work, that, thinking about the union as the sort of central organ of the feminist movement doesn't make any sense, that it's going to kind of happen in all these like less causes and institutions that don't sort of seem even to be oppositional at first, that there's there's feminist organizing happening at the World Bank or something like that. So I mean, when I don't yet know, I mean, as usual, when I'm working through an idea at this point, I'm kind of just sort of asking these questions and not sure which answer, which kind of is. That's sort of where I've been thinking about these questions recently.
Do you guys have thoughts? All right, Miranda.
I'll just say quickly that it strikes me that I don't know about the labor union as the central organ, but as a foundation. It seems to me that if a person has job security, a living wage, is not fearing sexual harassment or retaliation in the workplace, it frees up a lot of emotional, mental space and energy to work on other kinds of organizing, other kinds of feminist endeavors that they might also be interested in. So I don't know these. I've written down these books that you mentioned because I would also like to read them, and they sound very interesting. But it does seem to me like having, like, as long as we live in a society that is capitalist and that requires most of us to go into an office or interact with a boss, that if you free a person from the suite of pressures that come from being in a compromised position as a laborer, then they can be a much more effective advocate for their rights in other spaces as well.
I've just been thinking a lot recently about the ways that organizing and reproductive labor just seem sometimes difficult to even like formally tell apart. I know I'm not the first person by any means to come to this conclusion, but I think like as a relatively new organizer, like taking the lead so much until like pretty recently on anything. I've been thinking a lot about how the kind of the kinds of day-to-day like living in the world lend themselves kind of like flow into organizing work. And I think it's jumped out at me, I think, a lot because the stuff that I've been involved in recently has largely been around trying to organize my building. And there's, that's a model where it's not the workplace. It already is centered in the home and in reproductive labor kind of to begin with. But the way, the kind of like, I would imagine that this is like even a kind of like play on words that probably has been formulated by, I'm guessing, like women tenant organizers like a century ago, although I don't know. But the idea that kind of like you organize your kitchen, so you organize your building, like that there's like an actual kind of like again, like a real kind of like formal correspondence there. And I think that I don't know, to me seems to be at the heart, I guess, of some of the questions of like what is or isn't feminist organizing, like what does or doesn't kind of like count as being part of that framework. Is that it's like, I guess if you think about it less as like who is the subject at the center of the struggle and more like what is the way in which the struggle is being conducted, then it seems like that's one way of kind of turning the question on its side and so being able to answer it differently.
That's such a great observation. I remember when I started, I was really intimidated of organizing because I thought that you had to be like at least in a grad student context, like a kind of theory boy. Like I was like, oh, right, like that's like, this is what they do. And then when I started doing it, I remember saying to a friend, oh, organizing is just caring about people. Oh, I've been doing that all my life. Like that, like that. Oh, it's just talking to people and like genuinely and compassionately asking them about their lives and how their lives can be better and, forging relationships with them. Oh, that's, I've been socialized to do that and to do that well since I was a verbal person. So I think, yeah, thinking about, I love what you said, Ari, about the reproductive labor, the work of social reproduction, all the work that is sort of feminized, which is caretaking and demonstrating affection and all of that, is also the work of organizing when done in the kind of deep way that we want to do it. So I think that's a lovely way to just think about the to do feminist organizing and what that looks like.
I want to leave some time for some audience Q&A. Maggie, was there anything you wanted to talk about apropos of editing? Or can we let that one slide? You're on mute.
Sorry, I saw the rainbow of death for a second there and it wasn't letting me do anything. No, we can let that one slide. Although I would love at some point to hear about like editing as collaboration. I think that would be a great piece.
Cool. So attendees, if you have some questions, you can throw them in the Q&A box and we will take a look at them. So first, we have a comment from an anonymous attendee who says, as a second wave organizer and participant, I find it interesting and disappointing to hear how interested you are in the documents we left behind, but I don't hear or sense any interest in actually talking to us. We aren't dead or senile. I know that I certainly have a response to that as somebody who spends a lot of time with organizers from this era, but Maggie, you guys, do you have anything you want to say first?
I'll just say that in the process of researching my book, I did interview women who participated in the Institute, but many of them didn't identify themselves as feminists or as organizers. So that was a very different conversation. But that was also interesting to hear from women who had witnessed that kind of social transformation, but had not themselves participated in it, but had been part of these conversations kind of before the women's liberation movement took
off. I will just add that to the anonymous attendee, I'm sorry that that was the impression that we gave. For myself, I actually, with a lot of my friends are over the age of 68 years old. And one of the projects that I'm most sort of involved in right now is a memorial prize for a feminist, Anne Snitow, who passed away last year. The Anne Snitow Prize is a $10,000 award that we've raised money for to give out to one person for 10 years in a row, who is a feminist intellectual and organizer in the sort of tradition. And on the executive committee, I had the pleasure of working with 6 or 7 different women who were all organizing in that era and continue to be writers and activists and academics. And reading the applications for that prize has been amazing because you see how much the work of that moment is being continued by a huge array of people across the United States and elsewhere. So don't worry, we know you're not dead. We're still talking to you and working with you. I'm going to look at the next one. Somebody said, the internet getting divergent viewpoints on this same event. What is the idea infrastructure of feminism? Ari, I think that was your comment. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of realized as I was coming out of my mouth that is maybe a strange thing to say, and not even a thing that I would fully agree with now that I've said it. But I guess I think what I meant was, and like I think it's easier to explain it if like zooming out from like specifically feminism to just like the left. That I think that there's a perception that, you know, you see like all the time in sort of conservative to centrist to popular opinion, that like the left is this monolith and, you know, we're all trying to like cancel everybody and, you know, whatever, you know, the whole drill. And my perception is that when you are on the left, it not only doesn't feel that way, but in fact, it feels like things are intensely factionalized a lot of the time. And I guess what I actually was thinking when I said that earlier is that even though I definitely do not think that we are monolith, and the same, this could be said about feminism as well, more specifically. I do think that the way that communication technology just works now, there's like the possibility of a kind of like, I don't know, centralization of thought. That sounds like a little bit dystopian in a way that I actually don't intend. But like, there's a way that it's possible for people to be, if not necessarily like in agreement with each other, to be at least aware of what other people are doing who are working on similar projects in kind of other localities. And I think that is actually like, it just seems relatively new. Like in the way, it just seems like one of those kind of basic, like, kind of like shifts in media that like will maybe be like very obvious someday, in the way that like the rise of the novel had like obvious implications or something, So there's there's just something. Sorry, I'm just going on about this, and I don't even know what it has to do. Let me see if I can like try to bring it back to the original question and the topic at hand. I think basically that like there is real possibility in the fact that we do have like 1,000
comfortable having with, people who are like you in one way or another can still be overheard by others. And I think it's actually that eavesdropping nature of discourse has been like a massively educational tool, I think, particularly for white women around anti-Black racism or just racism in general. I just remember that moment in 2014, 15, where it just seemed like every single publication was publishing roundtables. And there were just a lot of, or podcasts, there were just like suddenly this new technology for people to talk almost like CR style among each other about how they felt about stuff in a way that was very relatable. If you were listening, you were not necessarily the addressee, but you got to pick up on so much that you wouldn't if you had not been invited by the broadcast or had been physically in the room. There's like actually conversations that are really helpful to learn from precisely because you were not in the room. And I think that that is a really crucial part of the new idea infrastructure for feminism online. Okay, I'm gonna jump to, I'm gonna ask maybe a few more questions and then wrap it up. So a question for Maggie, curious what the relationship the equivalents had to Radcliffe and the Academy in general as an institution. Do you agree with the story that says that Academy has swallowed up much of the intellectual energy on the left in the feminist movement? And what role does grad unionism play in that? And then I think I'm going to just tack on another question because it's also about Radcliffe, which is what happened to the Institute at Radcliffe? Did it become the Bunting Institute? Did its character or personnel ever change? Was it folded into the Institute for Advanced Study? So part one, sort of what was the relationship with Radcliffe? What happened to Radcliffe? And then part two is broader thoughts about the Academy swallowing up intellectual left and feminism.
Yeah, I'll start just with a quick like overview of the history of the Institute that was asked. So it existed in its current form, or in the form that I describe in the book, which is as a fellowship program for women Although the women that came to the Institute changed a lot through the 80s and 90s, the reach of the program was much broader. It was much more diverse, both in terms of race and class. It became more sort of conscious of need in different ways, financial need, etc. And it was a really vibrant community. There was a book fair every year where editors from New York and publishers would come, and they'd go to the Institute and they'd hear about the book projects from all the scholars and writers working there. It merged when Radcliffe merged formally with Harvard in 1999. Title IX actually dictated that there couldn't be a gender segregated institution like the Institute. So part of the institutional transformation had to do with the merger of Radcliffe and Harvard. And so now the form that the Institute exists in, there is this thing called the Radcliffe Institute, which encompasses Schlesinger Library, which is where I did a ton of this research. It's an amazing resource for feminist history, and the librarians and archivists there, where there would be no book without them. The archival work that they did to, catalog and find and acquire these documents is just so impressive and outstanding. So the Institute encompasses that and a few other institutions. And then there's this thing called the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, which is a fellowship program very, very similar to the Institute, artists as well as scholars, except it's open to people of all gender identities. So that's the kind of brief institutional history. The relationship with Radcliffe College was really interesting. So when the program was announced in November 1960 that there would be this new initiative, it was a really mixed response from Radcliffe alums. Some were extremely excited, and you see their thank you notes and their notes of congratulations in the archive, and some were really offended. They thought that this project to kind of encourage women to get into academic life or to keep pursuing some kind of professional accomplishment, they viewed that as a criticism of their life course, which had been to attend Radcliffe and then marry and raise children and mostly work in the home. And so you find these very angry letters from a bunch of Radcliffe alums, one of which included a 23 stanza poem about the sort of joys of motherhood and how Polly Bunting was taking women away from that. There's a historian I spoke with during the research who said she once gave a talk at the Junior League in Boston to kind of pitch the Institute. She'd been roped into it by the director. And the way she remembered it is she said it felt like going to battle. Just the response from many of these women who had attended Radcliffe was just incredibly aggressive. They told her she was ruining her children. She was scarring them for life by leaving them at home. How could she do this? Who did she think she was? And, she said, we're talking in 2016. She said, I hate them. I still hate them. I still feel so angry about this this encounter that I had. So it was, it was it was kind of separate from the college, but it did court all of this attention from the college and from the Radcliffe Corporation that was mixed. The role of the university in the left is so fascinating, and I wish we had like an entire other hour to talk about, the university. What is it? What can it do? What can it not do? Should we burn it down? Increasingly, I think yes. That's kind of where I'm at these days. I teach first year writing to college undergraduates and feel increasingly frustrated with so much of the corporate university. But I think that one advantage to thinking about activism or organizing in a university context is it's such a uniting force as an employer. In N+1, Gabriel Wynett has written about university organizing and why it's a good move right now, because these are often institutions that employ so many people in a community or in a city at so many different levels, and you can do a lot of sort of solidarity work if you think about the university as the opposing force, or as the university administration as the opposing force. This was happening obviously in the 60s and 70s with the free speech movement and with the sit-ins at Columbia in '68, and so there's definitely like a long history of the university both being a site that sponsors writers and activists and intellectuals to generate this kind of thought, but also gathers people together to combat the university as the kind of oppressive force. So maybe that the centrality of the university in that context can sometimes work to the left's advantage.
That was great. This is a question for Miranda. How do you feel about sisterhood, motherhood, and creative collaboration? This is from somebody who missed a bit of the beginning of the discussion, but it's true that we haven't heard from you on those topics, if you would like to weigh in.
I would say generally pro collaboration. I do, and this has been brought up before, I think maybe by all three of you, but there is this sort of natural conflict between the sort of solitary work of writing or making whatever kind of art it is that you make, which that tends to be a kind of solitary project, and the kind of collaborative ideal that the Radcliffe Institute was going for, and that I think many of us are missing, especially right now, in a moment when we are more isolated than usual. And I think one of the things that can be said for the university, as well as it does really effectively bring people together in order to combat the university, and I think it also brings people together so that they can forge these collaborative relationships while also having space to work on their own projects. And I think I mentioned something about this a bit earlier, but the sharing of work and the sort of back and forth that's modeled in Maggie's book especially by Maxine Cumin and Sexton is it's the kind of relationship that I think opens up a lot. Reading about it was exciting in part because it opened up a space of possibility in terms of how I thought about my relationships with other writers, and how, the ways in which it is possible for collaboration to exist without the collapse of individuality and subjectivity. So, yeah.
Okay, I think let's take we can take one more. Somebody brought up the possibility that friendship is anti-institutional, and curious to know thoughts on friendship as a political model and how it might be different or similar to other forms of collectivity.
I think that's such a good question, which is probably one of the reasons we're all like taking a second to really sit with it. I mean, I'll just to give the sort of like historian take on this, in my ongoing moonlight. I think one of the reasons friendship became institutional, or institutions facilitated the friendships in the book and among the women at the Institute, is because of just the culture of domesticity in the 1950s and during the Cold War era, that the home was at that point seen as such a kind of bunker and a kind of central unit, and the family, the nuclear family, and specifically a particular ideal of the nuclear family was upheld really strongly as something that everyone, and especially women, should be striving for. So I think that this kind of institution, this sort of society of fellows or artist colony or something, the reason in this moment it was so important to forging friendships was because of the way it opposed the home, that it exists in a sort of oppositional relationship to the home. And all of the women in my book, I think, met in kind of institutional settings. So Sexton and Cumin met at a poetry workshop at the Boston Center for Adult Education. The two artists met each other through sort of shared gallery, just sort of the sort of Boston art world and the institutions that facilitated this. Although now that I'm talking this out, I'm thinking of the one exception, which was the close friendship between Olson and Sexton, which began as letters. Through letters, they were on mutual admirers. They admired each other's writing. And maybe it's not an accident that the most radical of the women in this group, the leftists, the kind of committed anti-institutionalists who took teaching positions at universities only to tell universities how horrible they were and how bad they were at teaching literature, is Tillie Olson, who did actually form friendships, as this question suggests, very much outside of established institutions.
I think it's a great question, as you said, Maggie, and yeah, and a really complicated one. But what comes to mind for me is that I actually don't know that we would necessarily think of friendship, or even, something like the friend group and institutionality being at odds with each other, if we are talking about male groups of friends. And in that case, I think, if anything, there are very old associations of where those map onto each other, quite nicely, right? Like, so, the idea of military camaraderie, or union camaraderie, for that matter. In one sort of like conception of the industrial union, right? Like, there's so many different like examples that we could point to, and I think that the questions that you were just talking about, Maggie, are about partly it's a question of, well, what happens when the kind of like subordinate power of women's friendships, and I think that this might be true of sort of like mixed gender friendships as well, often. That the sort of subordinate or like anti-institutional power has a kind of charge, but then also has its limits, because there is also a kind of power that you get from either becoming part of, taking over, or forming an institution. And that, of course, is also a big part of the history of feminism, is what happens when friend groups become organizations, and and they change as a result.
Yeah, it strikes me that in the case of the Radcliffe Institute, there was a need for institutional support in order to get the women out of the institutions that were oppressing them. So there needed to be something just as powerful as the sort of cult of motherhood and the cult of suburban family life to get women to have these sort of perhaps traditionally anti-institutional relationships. The support of the institution was needed. And yeah, I just sort of wanted to add that, but I think it's really interesting what you were saying, Ari, about how male friendship has always been institutionalized, and the ways in which female friendship has been institutionalized has, the only thing that comes to mind is something like a sorority, which is sort of intellectually, in a sort of knee-jerk way, devalued, because there's a certain set of connotations that come along with I think one's image of a sorority, and it's not it's institutional, it's not particularly feminist necessarily. So I think that's really interesting.
Okay, change my mind. I'm going to ask one more question instead, which is, have any of you guys watched Mrs. America? Somebody wanted to know. Oh, and what did you think? I haven't watched it.
I haven't watched it, but as is often the case with something I haven't watched, I do have an opinion. Actually, one of the reasons that someone else who is in the audience who has watched it should feel free to jump in and tell me that I'm quite wrong in the Q&A. But one of the reasons I've resisted watching it is that I just don't want to watch that many hours of television about Phyllis Schlafly. I just don't want to. There's like a Renata Adler quote that I mention twice a week to anyone who will listen to me, which is about, she's talking about movies and how movies always argue for themselves. Images always argue for themselves. And she's talking specifically in the context of war films, how it's not possible to make an anti-war film because as long as you show violence, the violence sort of argues for itself. And seeing, images of Cate Blanchett in the little Phyllis Schlafly costume, I can't help thinking like that is an image that is arguing for itself. And my reaction to it has been like, I'm not interested in you, Phyllis Schlafly. Like I want to pay attention to other things. But again, have not seen it. This were pretty classic take from me. Have not seen it, have strong opinions about it.
I also have not seen it, but will also offer an opinion. Being on a panel is great. I do want to see it, and I'm planning to watch. But I think sort of related to what you were saying, Miranda, I know there was somebody connected to the show. I don't remember who it was. Who, there was like a little kerfuffle over the fact that they said when the show first aired, like kind of like, oh, well, like I think of Phyllis Schlafly as very much a feminist because, she ran a movement and she did it all. She had a family, but then also had a career. And it was like just a kind of amazing instance of somebody who was very close to their subject matter, seeming to, in some like really exceptional way, like miss the point. But I think that it points to something which is what Miranda was saying about, the image advertising itself. And I guess like I would actually bring it back to the conversation and the question of like, what does it mean to do feminist history? And what does it mean to kind of like overturn the rocks that, that actually tell us like very complicated stories that we don't know, where it's not clear, like, where we or our audiences will see themselves reflected. And I think that the question of like, does telling any story kind of run the risk of romanticizing it? And, what do you do about that as a storyteller, is just probably something that has come up with that show, just as it comes up with any of these projects.
I have to jump in because there's an entire part of my brain that has just been rotted by celebrity facts. So I actually know what you're referring to, Ari. It was Rose Byrne, and she was giving an interview on a podcast. I think she plays Gloria Steinem. And I cannot believe that I've interrupted this panel to defend Rose Byrne's honor, but she was making a joke about how Phyllis Schlafly benefited from feminism while at the same time trying to tear it down. Like, she was taking advantage of the liberties that the feminist movement had carved out, and at the same time was trying to ensure that no other women had access to those liberties in the same way she had. But I find the whole the whole discussion so interesting, because I do think that is a legitimate. I think the reason that it was read that way is that is a legitimate takeaway that someone could get from the show. Like what iconic, like she was so powerful.
Megyn Kelly, girl boss. Philip Shapley, girl boss. Yes, so is it feminist? We're gonna answer that next time. Maggie, thank you so much for writing a beautiful book that we could have a panel around. Miranda, you too. And thank you all for coming. Please subscribe to N+1 and please buy Maggie's book.
Thank you all so much for organizing this and for talking with me. This has been amazing and just a dream event, digital or non. I can't imagine a better conversation.
All right, well, thank you guys so much. We're gonna do the weird thing where we like freeze and wave now. All right, bye.